She was born into one of the most powerful dynasties in history, but centuries of inbreeding had already written her fate before she drew her first breath. This is the story of the most inbred princess who ever lived, and the curse she could never escape. For centuries, the House of Habsburg chose a highly dangerous path to preserve their vast European empire. Rather than relying on the hazards of war, they turned inward, deliberately arranging marriages within their own family line. From the early 1500s, this strategy bound uncle to niece and cousin to cousin, trapping generation after generation in a tightening biological spiral. When Emperor Leopold I married Margaret Theresa of Spain in 1666, it was yet another uncle and niece union. Margaret Theresa, just 15 years old at her wedding, had spent her childhood calling her new husband uncle. Their marriage was designed to secure land and power, but the genetic cost of this union was staggering. Their only surviving child, Maria Antonia, born in 1669, inherited the full weight of this generational curse. Due to generations of overlapping family branches, Maria Antonia had only 6 great-grandparents instead of the usual 8. Modern geneticists have calculated her inbreeding coefficient at an astonishing 0.3053. To put that number in perspective, a child born to biological siblings has an inbreeding coefficient of 0.25. Even her infamous relative, Charles II of Spain, the tragic poster child of Habsburg physical deformity, carried a coefficient of 0.254. Maria Antonia's genetics were more concentrated, more entangled, than if her parents had been brother and sister. This extreme autozygosity filled her family tree with repeating names and introduced a hidden vulnerability into her very bones. Across Europe, the physical signs of this hereditary decline were already glaringly obvious, manifesting in the prominent, deformed Habsburg jaw that left some family members struggling even to chew their food. For Maria Antonia, the silent biological trap was already set. In Madrid, the devastating reality of this genetic compromise had already assumed the throne. In 1665, a 4-year-old boy named Charles II inherited the vast Spanish Empire. He was the living embodiment of the family's biological debt. Charles suffered from profound intellectual disability, severe skeletal deformities, and a jaw so misshapen he could barely chew. He could not walk without assistance, and by his 20s, he was already slipping into early onset dementia. Because Charles was entirely incapable of independent rule, a shifting council of regents and ambitious advisors governed Spain in his name. But his physical frailties hid a far graver existential threat to the continent. The genetic damage that ravaged his body had also rendered him completely infertile. As the years wore on without a successor, the personal tragedy of a disabled king transformed into a looming geopolitical catastrophe. The Spanish line of the House of Habsburg was grinding to a biological halt, threatening to plunge all of Europe into a war of succession. This was the exact same genetic path Maria Antonia was born to follow, a terrifying blueprint of what happened when a dynasty valued land over life. Maria Antonia was born into a world already haunted by silent nurseries. She was the only child of Emperor Leopold I and Margaret Theresa to survive infancy. 3 of her siblings perished within mere hours or days of their first breath. Death, a constant companion in the cold halls of the Hofburg Palace, struck again in March 1673. Her mother, Margaret Theresa, worn down by relentless pregnancies and the frailties of her own heavily inbred body, died at just 21 years old. At 4, Maria Antonia was motherless, left in a court ruled by dynastic calculations. Seeking a male heir, Leopold married twice more, selecting wives who were also his second cousins. When a half-brother, Joseph, was born at last in 1678, It seemed Maria Antonia's political importance might fade, but Spain's complex laws of succession dictated otherwise. Because Joseph belonged to a different maternal line, Maria Antonia remained the sole surviving descendant of the Spanish branch, making her the ultimate prize on the European chessboard. Her childhood became a public affair. Diplomats watched her every step, while her painted portraits were dispatched to royal courts across Europe, presenting a fragile survivor whose very existence carried the weight of an empire. Behind the high, gilded doors of the Hofburg, Maria Antonia's daily life was defined by the strict formality of the imperial court. From her first breath, she lived under constant observation, with foreign diplomats passing her health and movements for any sign of physical weakness. To prepare her for a world she would never rule, she was immersed in a rigorous humanist curriculum, mastering Latin, French, and the complex structures of music. Those who knew the young Archduchess described a quiet, serious, and intelligent child, possessing a distinguished grace that surpassed her young age. Yet, this elegant cultivation was ultimately a beautiful cage, designed only to polish her for the marriage market. To her father, Emperor Leopold, his quiet daughter was simply an asset in the contest over the Spanish succession. Her inner feelings, her quiet dignity, and her own preferences were entirely irrelevant to the men arranging her fate. In 1676, when Maria Antonia was only 6 years old, her father proposed her marriage to 13-year-old Charles II of Spain. The calculations of the Habsburg court were clear: bind the Austrian and Spanish branches together once again, keeping their vast inheritance intact. The engagement was formally announced, and a proxy wedding was scheduled for December of that year. Yet, this first transaction collapsed before the vows could be spoken. The Spanish court cancelled the arrangement, realizing that a child of 6 was still years away from bearing the heirs the dying dynasty desperately needed. Other doors closed just as quickly. A subsequent plan to marry her to Victor Amadeus II, the Duke of Savoy, was drawn up to counter French influence. But these negotiations also withered in the quiet rooms of diplomacy when the Savoyard court demanded territorial concessions in Lombardy that the Austrian treasury could not afford. By 1685, the options for the 16-year-old princess had narrowed to a single, final destination. She was promised to her second cousin, Maximilian II Emanuel, the Elector of Bavaria. The match was designed solely to secure a military alliance within the Holy Roman Empire. The marriage contract was signed on the 1st of December, and shortly after, Maria Antonia said farewell to the imperial court of Vienna. As she began her journey to Munich, she left behind the only home she had ever known to enter a life she had never chosen. In 1692, Maximilian's appointment as governor of the Spanish Netherlands moved the stage of Maria Antonia's isolation to Brussels. If she had hoped this new court might offer a fresh beginning, she was met instead with the full reality of her husband's character. A contemporary described the Bavarian elector as possessing one of the most perverse minds and hearts imaginable. They were complete opposites, bound by a treaty, but separated by a chasm of temperament. Maximilian was a loud, restless extrovert who craved the spotlight of court life. Maria Antonia was a studious, introverted teenager who preferred the quiet solace of her chambers and her books. In Brussels, this mismatch became a weapon. Maximilian openly paraded his mistress before the entire court, transforming public banquets into a theater of humiliation for his young wife. Forced to participate in the empty pageantry of the Bavarian administration, Maria Antonia had to endure the pitying stares and hushed whispers of foreign diplomats. The union was cold, loveless, and cruel from the start. Underneath the gilded ceilings of her new residence, the imperial princess was stripped of her dignity. serving as a political ornament for a man who treated her presence with utter contempt. In this hostile environment, she discovered that her royal blood bought her no protection from emotional brutality. For Maria Antonia, the emotional cruelty of her marriage was quickly eclipsed by a more intimate horror. To the House of Habsburg, her only value lay in her womb, but her heavily entangled genetics made childbearing a perilous descent. In May 1689, she gave birth to a son, Ferdinand. He died within days. A year later, a second son was born, only to perish almost immediately. The silent nurseries of her childhood had followed her to Bavaria. Terrified by these losses and desperate to escape her husband's toxic court, she fled. In 1691, pregnant for a third time, Maria Antonia made the grueling journey back to her father's palace in Vienna, flatly refusing to return to Munich. It was there, on the 28th of October, 1692, that she gave birth to a third son, Joseph Ferdinand. In Madrid and Vienna, dynastic relief erupted. This fragile infant was hailed as the long-awaited savior of the Spanish Empire. But this political triumph came at a ruinous cost. The birth had completely shattered Maria Antonia's already compromised body, demanding a physical price she could not afford to pay. 3 days after giving birth to the baby, hailed as a savior, Maria Antonia developed a raging fever. In the late 17th century, the medical world had no understanding of bacterial infections and no access to antibiotics. What we now know was puerperal sepsis was treated with the crude tools of the era: aggressive bloodletting, warm herbal poultices, and toxic doses of mercury. Instead of curing her, these desperate measures only drained her remaining vitality. As autumn turned to winter, the quiet rooms of the Hofburg Palace became a solemn vigil. Weeks dragged on as the young princess lay trapped in her bed, her strength slowly fading while her heavily compromised body struggled against the relentless heat of the infection. The court physicians could do nothing but watch her slip away. On the 24th of December, 1692, as the bells of Vienna rang in Christmas Eve, Maria Antonia died. She was only 23 years old, her brief life entirely consumed by the relentless demands of her family's dynastic ambitions. Behind her, in the quiet nursery, she left her infant son, Joseph Ferdinand. This motherless baby, carrying the same compromised genetics that had claimed his mother, was now the sole remaining hope to prevent a catastrophic war. He was a child born to carry the weight of an entire continent on his fragile shoulders. In Madrid and Vienna, the grief of Maria Antonia's death immediately hardened into cold, geopolitical calculation. The passing of the young archduchess did not pause the dynastic clock. Instead, it threw the future of the Spanish Empire into a sharp, pressing focus. All eyes turned to the cradle of the motherless infant, Joseph Ferdinand. As the great-grandson of Philip IV of Spain, this frail baby boy carried the most direct, legitimate bloodline to a crown that had no other viable heirs. For the Austrian Habsburgs, securing his position was not a matter of sentiment, but of survival. They pushed his claim with unyielding diplomatic pressure, presenting the child as the natural successor to the childless, failing Spanish King Charles II. Within the grand chambers of the Spanish court, the logic of his blood was undeniable. Despite the foreign rivalries swirling around Spain's vast territories, a broad agreement took hold among the influential ministers in Madrid. Joseph Ferdinand was not merely a Bavarian prince. He was recognized as the rightful, designated heir to the Spanish throne, the one fragile shield standing between Europe and a catastrophic war of succession. In February 1699, the fragile shield shattered. 6-year-old Joseph Ferdinand contracted smallpox and died in Brussels. With his sudden death, the carefully crafted compromise collapsed, and Maria Antonia's line ended entirely. The Austrian Habsburgs, refusing to relinquish their claim to Spain, shifted their ambitions to Emperor Leopold's younger son, Archduke Charles, but the diplomatic scales had already tipped. In November 1700, the agonizingly long reign of the childless Charles II of Spain came to an end. On his deathbed, surrounded by scheming advisors and facing the extinction of his dynasty, the dying king signed his final will. He bypassed the Austrian branch entirely, naming the 16-year-old French candidate, Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV, as the sole heir to his vast global empire. This single signature united the crowns of France and Spain, violating decades of treaties and triggering immediate, absolute outrage across Europe. The peace of the continent died with the last Spanish Habsburg. In 1701, the smoldering outrage erupted into the War of the Spanish Succession. For 13 brutal years, this conflict tore across the continent, dragging almost every major European power into its maw. Refusing to accept French dominion over Spain, Austria forged an alliance with England and the Dutch Republic. Though Philip V ultimately secured the Spanish throne, the war reshaped the map, compensating Austria with Belgium, Milan, Naples, and Sardinia. Yet, beneath the grand treaties lay a quiet, haunting truth. Had the curse of the Habsburg bloodline not claimed Maria Antonia at 23, or had her fragile son Joseph Ferdinand survived, this catastrophic war might have been avoided. The succession could have been settled in peace. Instead, the biological failures of a single dynasty were paid for in hundreds of thousands of lives, sealing the tragedy of a princess born a pawn, used as a pawn, and died as a pawn. We still remember the global war, her death unleashed, yet the woman herself remains lost to time. Maria Antonia's quiet tragedy reminds us that the truest cost of empire is always human. Born a pawn, used as a pawn, and died as a pawn, her very existence was sacrificed to a dynastic curse. Thank you for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments below.